We are at that point now where the CBC decision desk is prepared to make the call. The UCP will hold on to power in Alberta. The United Conservative government will remain in government.
And finally, my fellow Albertans, we need to come together no matter how we have voted to stand shoulder to shoulder against soon-to-be announced Ottawa policies that would significantly harm our provincial economy. Now, we have been made aware that in the coming weeks, Justin Trudeau is planning on bringing forward new restrictions on electricity generation from natural gas that will not only massively increase your power bills, but will also endanger the integrity and reliability of our entire power grid, which we rely on during our cold and dark Alberta winters. In addition, the Prime Minister is already ready to introduce a de facto production cap on our oil and gas sector that, if implemented, will result in tens of thousands of jobs lost, tens of billions in lost investment, damage our province's fiscal position, and bring economic hardship to Albertans.
Voters in Alberta have chosen the United Conservative Party for the second time in a row, this time with Danielle Smith as Premier. To talk about what this all means for young Albertans and Canada as a whole, and whether we'll have an election sooner than 4 years, I am joined once again by Laurie Williams, Associate Professor at Mount Royal University. Here's our conversation now. And Laurie Williams joins me again. Laurie, thanks for coming back on Political Debrief.
It's great to be with you, Josh.
So I want to start off, usually elections in Alberta are not very close, especially provincial ones, and historically in the past. This one was very close, though. I'm curious, why do you think that is?
Well, a number of factors contributed to that. One of them is the controversies surrounding both the United Conservative Party under Jason Kenney and then specifically around Danielle Smith. The election campaign was just a series of controversial recordings and writings by Danielle Smith, statements that she'd made that raised a lot of questions about her judgment, about what she really believed, her commitment to publicly funded healthcare, her understanding of healthcare. All kinds of questions emerged, particularly around the finding of an ethics by the ethics commissioner that she broke the Conflicts of Interest Act by trying to interfere in the outcome of a trial of a very controversial street pastor who basically fomented violence against the RCMP at the Coots border crossing protest. So I think the controversy surrounding the United Conservative Party, and particularly around Danielle Smith, made it, and of course she lost 14 seats at this point in terms of the count. That certainly had an impact on them. It opened a way for other parties. The only other party that seemed to have any traction at all in this election was the NDP, who picked up the seats that were lost by the UCP, and they came very, very close to winning in a number of other ridings. I mean, you can play the arithmetic either direction. You move some of these close ridings onto the UC side, and you've got a bigger majority. You move some of them onto the NDP side, and you've got an NDP majority. It just shows you how close this election was and why the pollsters had so much trouble determining or deciding or predicting what would happen in the final analysis.
I'm curious. So then it sounds like what you're saying is that this election was more about Albertans deciding whether or not they wanted Danielle Smith as premier than any other policy specifically, or that they want Rachel Notley as premier.
Well, policy, I think, entered into it, but because the two parties were making promises that looked similar to one another, and because of the issues that were surrounding Danielle Smith, and also questions being raised about Rachel Notley's record while she was premier. This came down to a question more than anything else about the leadership ability, the qualities that each of the leaders had, and who people thought might be better to bring about what the vision that they were promising. Now, Danielle Smith, as we see in these numbers, different. I mean, just to show you how close it was in this election, usually we say that Alberta politically is like a three-legged stool. And in order to win, you need to win two of the three legs. One is Edmonton, one is Calgary, one is rural Alberta. The NDP won Edmonton by a landslide. They won the majority of the vote and seats in Calgary, and Danielle Smith won rural Alberta. And so there were some folks in rural Alberta, particularly those on the far right wing or even fringe, some might say, of the United Conservative Party, that were very solidly supportive of her. And then a whole lot of other folks that were really stuck trying to figure out whether they could go ahead with the United Conservative Party, vote Conservative in spite of some of their concerns. In fact, there were candidates at the doorstep saying, "Go ahead, vote for us, and then we'll get rid of Danielle Smith after the election." On the other hand, there were people who were looking at Rachel Notley and the fact that she was the leader of the NDP and wondering if they could go as far as voting NDP in this election. And I think both Rachel Notley's record economically and the fact she introduced a tax hike on large corporations in this election, those seem to have been pretty decisive issues for her. So it came down to leadership and who could be trusted with what was most important to folks. For those who have found healthcare most important, many of them voted for Rachel Notley and the NDP. For those who were worried about the economy, many of them voted for Danielle Smith and the UCP.
So in terms of the policy that was discussed, I'm curious your thoughts on policy that's most likely to be enacted and also policy that affects young people. What do you think about that?
Well, I'll say, first of all, what the big issues in the election were: healthcare, affordability, and the economy, maybe as a related issue to affordability. On affordability, both parties were pretty close. On healthcare, the NDP had an advantage. On the economy, Conservative parties typically have an advantage. But I don't think that the policies of either party were really well focused on youth issues. And of course, the NDP needed young voters to come out in good numbers in order to do better in this election. And that doesn't seem to have happened in terms of voter turnout. So yes, so a lot of the affordability supports that were provided by the UCP government were targeted at parents of kids under 18, seniors, and folks on disability payments and that sort of thing. And nothing for young folks that are, students that are going to school. Both of them said they would cap student fees or tuition. The NDP talked a little bit more about reducing their interest rate, and the availability of student loans is going to be opened up by the NDP. So they did try to target students with some of their policies. And then the UCP sort of responded and said, "Yeah, well, we'll cap tuition too," but they didn't say anything about student loans, interest rates, and so forth. The NDP said, "Look, we're going to reach out and we're going to provide affordability payments to younger people who aren't on the list for the UCP," because basically the UCP was targeting their voters with those affordability payments. And Rachel Notley sought to include them. I'm not sure that those policies were really resonating amongst young voters. We did see good numbers coming out in some areas, but not in the kinds of numbers that the NDP needed to win.
And I'm curious, you mentioned the NDP, and they have a stronger opposition. It's still a majority government for the United Conservative Party. So, I mean, there's not a really whole lot of power that the opposition has. But I'm curious if you think that stronger NDP opposition, and as you mentioned, they really courted the young vote, the NDP. Do you think that will have an impact on some of the ways that this government addresses issues that affect young Albertans?
Well, I do, because again, you've got a stronger opposition and a potentially vulnerable majority. So Danielle Smith is sitting at 49 seats. We're still waiting for a couple of recounts, but she's currently sitting at 49 seats. That's a bit of a cushion. She needs 44 to have a majority, 45 to have a majority and a speaker. That means she's got a 4-seat cushion. If, as some are wondering, some of these further right folks start to threaten whether to vote against the government in a vote of confidence, or if they decide to leave and have a separate sort of sitting group in the legislature. If some of them leave, or for whatever reason seats become vacant, that majority could really be in jeopardy. So the challenge for Danielle Smith is going to be to try to keep a really disparate bunch of people who disagree with one another, dislike one another in many cases, to try to keep them together. And so it's a fractured party, and not just sort of on left-right lines. There are all kinds of libertarians disagree with the social conservatives on some issues. There are fiscal conservatives that disagree with others on some issues. So there's a range of disagreements amongst these folks. And the Take Back Alberta bunch are feeling pretty powerful right now. They have half the seats on the UCP board. They influence the votes in a number of races. They ran candidates that were explicitly connected with Take Back Alberta, and they run the constituency associations for some of those ridings as well. And so people are going to be watching to see what Take Back Alberta does and what kind of influence they have, and whether that's something that is embraced by the sort of more moderate conservatives. So floor crossings are a possibility, break-off parties are a possibility. People leaving or losing their seats for whatever reason, being ejected from the party, all of those could mean that we don't make it to the next election scheduled in 4 years, but something else could happen. So put all that together, a strong, bigger caucus for the NDP with a number of really talented candidates. Those people can advocate, I think, quite effectively for some of the policies, not just saying what the government is not doing right, but what they should be doing that's better. And some of those can have significant impact depending on how they resonate with the electorate.
And sorry, can you just explain to us quickly what Take Back Alberta is?
Oh, sure. So Take Back Alberta is a very well-organized group of individuals who claim credit for getting rid of Jason Kenney and for installing Danielle Smith as premier. So they are very far to the right. They opposed the vaccine mandates, COVID policies, generally speaking, any kinds of restrictions associated with it. They're rurally based in Alberta, and they are led by a fellow by the name of David Parker, who has not just organized this particular group to try to force the leadership review of Jason Kenney and then bring Danielle Smith into office, but they control half of the seats on the United Conservative board, which they did right after Danielle Smith was elected. They organized their group to win half of those elected seats on the board. They control a number of constituency associations, and they're promising to try to push their views on others. Now, David Parker has made some really controversial comments, notably that this isn't a left-right election, it's a human-non-human election, and that the non-humans include women who have careers instead of giving birth to children. He's very far to the right, very religiously based, if you like, and he represents a quite different sort of, or contentious fringe of the party. But they're well organized and they're having a significant influence.
So it's interesting you mentioned that, because I was thinking as you were talking about, the very difficult job that Danielle Smith is going to have keeping her caucus together. I kind of think of that in the US in a sense where there's like two major parties, a more left-leaning party, a more right-leaning party, and there's all these factions inside the parties that are constantly warring. We saw that in early January with the Freedom Caucus in the US, who held the speakership ransom for about a week. Do you think that Alberta is turning into kind of a Canadian example of US-style politics?
I wouldn't say overall, but there's certainly some in Alberta who have a great affinity for U.S. politics, and they are being influenced by U.S. politics. And we saw this during the convoy and Coots border crossing protests. They were getting money from the United States, inspiration from some folks in the United States. They were being interviewed on and talked about on far right media outlets in the United States. And in fact, David Parker and other members of Take Back Alberta actually were saying, well, if Rachel Notley wins, we're going to hold her hostage the way they're doing in the United States. I mean, clearly they didn't understand how the system works at all. If Rachel Notley had won a majority, only two parties were going to get seats in the legislature, they wouldn't have had any power at all. But now they could very well exert a lot of influence on Danielle Smith. And that's what people are going to be watching for, what that looks like. Now, has to be said that they don't have as much room to agitate against the premier, because if the government comes down, they actually lose power. So there may be an incentive for them to play ball for at least a little bit of time, but there may be pressure coming from the grassroots for both them and Danielle Smith to move in a direction that isn't shared by the majority of Albertans. The majority of Albertans supported COVID restrictions in order to protect the healthcare system. And so Take Back Alberta, both on social conservative views, on COVID views, etc., are not in line or in keeping or in sync with the majority of Albertans. And if they continue to exert influence, if Danielle Smith continues to sort of align with them, that could actually open up room for other parties at the center.
Do you foresee that Alberta could return to a multi-party system? I mean, I know technically they have a multi-party system now, but realistically, there's only two main parties right now. Do you see a path for like 3 or 4 parties in the legislature in Alberta?
It's tricky to talk about returning to a multi-party system in Alberta because until 2015, when Rachel Notley won government, we'd essentially had a one-party system. It had been the Progressive Conservatives for 44 years. Before that, it had been Social Credit. We have a history in Alberta of dominance by one party. And even though there are other parties, none of them seem to be in a position to hold government. People wondered if that was starting to change in 2015. I think they're still wondering if that's changing. But what we're seeing now is people are saying, look, there's such a difference between the options here that they're not even so much voting for, or maybe they're afraid to vote for the party that they see as reflecting their values most closely. In many cases, they're voting for the party that has the best chance of defeating the party they're most worried about or that they most disagree with. So a lot of people voted NDP in this election. People spoke about lending your vote to the NDP. You don't have to become a member of the NDP. You don't have to be an NDPer, to use some of the language that was being thrown around. All you need to do is vote for a party that's more moderate than the UCP. And for some people, that was the determinant of their vote.
And then going from the UCP to the NDP, it seems like Rachel Notley is going to stay on as leader. Former premier, got elected 2015, lost in 2019, lost again this year. Do you think that the membership of the NDP are going to be satisfied with the leadership of Rachel Notley? Have you been hearing, or do you think there are any other names that could be surfacing for leader of the opposition?
Sure, lots of people have been speculating what's going to happen to the leadership of the NDP. But the reality is Rachel Notley is more popular than the NDP party is. So she's a really strong leader. She's recruited a lot of the candidates she's bringing into caucus. She's a sort of a known and admired quantity in Alberta politics. So I see her staying on, at least in the short term, particularly since it's possible that over the next couple of years, we could be looking at another election if some of these unpredictable factors come into play. But I also think that in the long run, it'll, I think, basically be up to Rachel Notley which way she goes here. But I think she's going to see, look, in this just completed election, her record was a liability. It was one of the things that prevented some voters from going over to vote for the NDP. And I think a lot of people recognize, including Rachel Notley, recognize that that's going to make it tougher to contest an election in the future. And so perhaps from this very talented caucus that she's just brought in with her in this last election, or perhaps somebody from the outside, probably somebody from Calgary, if somebody with a lot of political talent and potential decides they want to run for the leadership of the NDP, I think she'd be happy to hand that mantle over to somebody who might be able to bring new supporters, a new vision, new momentum to the NDP party. Because in 2015, the NDP won because there was vote splitting on the right between the Wild Rose and the Progressive Conservative Party. This time, all those parties on the right before the election day, their support collapsed and it all moved over to the UCP and enabled them to win this election. That was one of the significant factors in the win of the United Conservative Party. But it now looks like a party at the center left could actually defeat outright the United Conservative Party, particularly if it's to the right of Albertans, and this alternative is presented as a moderate one. So I think there'll be more disconnection from the federal NDP. There might even be a change of name, as we've seen in other provinces, to try to accomplish that difference and to remove one of the liabilities that Rachel Notley and the NDP faced in this election.
So today we're recording this on June 2nd. It is the 1-year anniversary of the election in Ontario where Doug Ford built up his majority. There was a word that was very common in that campaign. I don't think it was very common in this campaign, and we haven't mentioned it yet. It's education. What's up with that? Because usually education is a major issue in a provincial election.
Yeah, it's a bit of a puzzle, particularly since the UCP introduced a new K-6 curriculum that was enormously controversial. 57 out of 61 school boards refused to pilot the program because it was so deeply flawed. Jason Kenney touted it as a remedy to the ideological curriculum of the NDP, but in fact, the curriculum that came in under the NDP had been worked on by progressive conservatives and the NDP. It was not the ideological curriculum was not the one that Jason Kenney got rid of. It was the one that he used to replace the current one. I'm surprised that wasn't talked about more in this election. It's one of a number of issues that I expected to get more attention, but for whatever reason, those other priorities, healthcare and affordability, just eclipsed just about everything else. Now, they both said, both Rachel Notley and Danielle Smith talked about things like hiring more teachers, giving more money to school boards. One of the points they disagreed on were charter schools and who would have access to those schools, who would have control over those schools, and also the building of schools. They both talked about some of those issues, but they didn't really go head to head on charter schools. They didn't really go head to head on, beyond saying generally that they would hire more teachers and educational assistants and so forth. Wasn't a lot of detail on those platforms. And even if that detail had been provided, I don't know that would have gotten the attention or whether it would have determined votes. As it happened, those other issues just dominated. As I mentioned before, I think a lot of university students were very worried about things like tuition, about funding for universities and so forth. But again, didn't really take off as a central campaign issue.
And the topic of the last episode that we did together was about the Alberta Sovereignty Act. And at that point of our conversation, the legislation hadn't been tabled. We didn't really know anything about it. We know a lot more now, and that it's not as much of an iron fist as Danielle Smith said it would be when she was running for UCP leader. I'm curious how you think the potential use of that act, now that we know a lot more about the state of what the act is and the state of politics in Alberta, what do you think the impact would be of Danielle Smith using that act in Alberta?
Yeah, that's really difficult to know. We know what the legislation actually reads like, but we still don't know what it's going to mean in practice. Beyond possibly trying to interfere with federal rules that the Alberta government disagrees with, maybe penalizing people who carry out those rules or enforce some of those laws. This could be municipalities or even police officers potentially, enforcing firearms regulations and so forth. We really don't know what it's going to mean in practice. So Danielle Smith has, as she did in her election night speech, promised that Albertans can unite behind her fighting with Ottawa to advance Alberta's interests. But the reality is that Albertans have a lot of different views on what's in Alberta's interest. The problem for Danielle Smith, she could speak, in strong words, but what that's going to mean in practice? She doesn't have the constitutional authority on some issues. She's not going to make much of a difference. It's ironic, perhaps, that Rachel Notley got more headway with respect to pipelines than anybody before her or since her in the last 50 or more years. Danielle Smith, if she's too combative, could actually undermine Alberta's interest. It could make it more difficult to get federal funding or support in certain areas. And the reality is, when it comes to getting the federal government to move on issues, you need allies. You need other provincial leaders or premiers to help you along with that. And she only has one ally. That's Scott Moe. Quebec Ontario, Maritimes, BC, none of them are interested in taking on that combative tone right now. So I think there are a lot of questions about how effective the use of the Sovereignty Act or any of this rhetoric. I don't know what difference it's going to make because I think other tools need to be used, and I'm not sure she's got them available to her right now.
My last question for you: what do you think will determine the success or unsuccess or lack of success of this re-elected UCP government?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. Again, because the party is so fractured on a number of different lines, I think it's going to be a very difficult party to lead, and it'll be a real test of Danielle Smith's leadership. If she's able to keep them together and keep them from erupting into controversies, the kinds of things that dogged Jason Kenney for most of his premiership, if she's able to do that, then that'll be a sort of a new side of Danielle Smith that we haven't seen up until this point. And I think the other thing that might make a difference is if she's able to negotiate or work with other governments to try to advance Alberta's interests. So she can keep her party in line, move forward on things that are acceptable broadly in Alberta. I think she'll have a much easier time of things. If she starts to advance on things that are unpopular in Alberta, things like a pension plan, getting rid of the Canadian pension plan, moving forward on, again, public polling, responses by organizations in rural Alberta included, do not agree with replacing the RCMP. And yet the UCP has persisted in exploring pension, getting rid of the Canada Pension Plan and getting rid of the RCMP. So I guess it depends who she listens to and how she's able to reconcile the demands being made by the folks on the right for getting rid of the RCMP and the pension plan and the majority of Albertans who don't agree with those policies. She said she wants to have a referendum. If there's a referendum and there is no support for the pension plan, I guess she can say to the Take Back Alberta folks or the folks on the right, look, there's not enough support. We can't do that. But I do think it's going to be a challenge for her to try to balance the very different and conflicting demands that are being made by people within her party. And it looks actually like there are a couple people, at least in the party, that they're acting like they're running for the leadership to replace her already.
All right, Lori Williams, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Josh.
And that's it for this episode of Political Debrief. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I would invite you to check out the links down below for some more information about the subjects that we're talking about. As well, feel free to follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Josh_Oliverio. Connect with the show online at politicaldebrief.com, and there you can sign up for our newsletter so you don't miss a single episode alert. Thanks once again for watching, and see you on the next episode.